Okay, I'm going to try and do this very differently. I'm the kind of guy who likes to walk around, and I'm going to have to stay here at my podium, and it's just not me. But anyway, I'll do my best. So today we're going to talk about depression and burnout. And why are we going to talk about depression and burnout together? Because we often confuse the two terms, and sometimes we actually are referring to the same thing, and sometimes we're referring to different things. So I think the questions we want to ask ourselves is, when something isn't right with us, what's going on? Are we depressed? Are you burning out? Are you sick in some way, physically, mentally? And if so, in what way are you sick? Do you need to change something in your life? Are you mentally ill? Now, we're going to explore some of that. I am assuming you covered some of that territory last week, but we'll get into some detail today as well. Is it time to see your doctor, or a shrink, or your best friend, or your priest? So today we're going to really examine the question of mood, because that's what depression is all about. We really want to explore what is it that makes our mood go up or go down, and what affects us, what affects how we feel about ourselves or about things around us. We'll briefly review the diagnosis of depression as is defined as a mental illness. I'm not going to focus that much on depression. It's not going to be a very clinical lecture. You're not interested in symptoms and indications and so on. I'm going to talk about what it's like to live depression, what it's like to feel bad. Maybe help understand a little bit what the role of our brains are and what the role of the circumstances around us are. And more importantly, to understand how our personalities interact with those experiences. Because we experience events all the time. We observe, we see, and two people might experience the same thing, and some of whom will feel bad and some of whom will not. We're going to take a few moments also to explore stress. Stress obviously is a factor that influences both burnout, depression, anxiety, a number of things. And if we have some time, we'll take a look at some of the treatment issues. So let's start with the question of what affects our moods. Think about this, okay? Some people say, well, I'm having a bad day. Now, what does that mean? Some people just say, well, it's the way I am. Some days I feel good, some days I feel bad. So certainly we have different moods, and we don't always know what the causes are. Sometimes we might say, well, maybe I just have a lousy job. I don't like what I do, and it takes up so much of my time. Or maybe I have a lousy relationship, or maybe I don't have a relationship. Maybe I have problems interpersonally, I have problems with my family members, and so on. So interpersonal kinds of problems certainly affect how we feel. Perhaps you didn't sleep last night. A lot of people say, well, I'm just tired, that's why I'm in a lousy mood, or that's why I'm down. Maybe you're in bad shape. You don't exercise, everything is such an effort. Walking upstairs, your body is heavy. At the end of the day, if you work out, you feel pretty good. If not, you don't. Some people say, well, depression runs in my family. My parents are always negative, my grandparents, they've been treated, and so on. So is there some sort of biological disposition? Genetic disposition, rather? Maybe it's just the way you are. You're born that way. Maybe you have one of them biochemical imbalances you keep hearing about in all the TV commercials, right? Maybe it's something you ate. We'll actually explore that, because our biochemistry is affected by the neurotransmitters in our brains, and the neurotransmitters are affected by the nutritional components that we consume. That's where it comes from. That's where all our chemistry comes from. Through their mouth, usually. Sometimes the sun, but other things. Of course, you might have teenagers that are acting like, well, teenagers. I have 4 of them at home, so I certainly can argue that they have an influence on your mood. Anyway, it's not an exhaustive list. We can go on and on. But the point is that a number of things affect how we feel. And all of it feeds the brain. The brain, obviously, is where our moods are. The brain is where our thoughts are. The brain is where our beliefs and perceptions are. Everything is biochemical. So of course, when you're depressed or when you're anxious or when anything is happening, there is some sort of biochemical imbalance, or if you will, some biochemical effect. Now, if I were to ask this person what her name was, what's your name? Sue. Hi, Sue, how are you? If in a few minutes I turn around and I look at Sue and I say, hi, Sue, ask yourself, how is it that I recall her name? At some level, you have changed my brain. There is a biochemical change in my brain now, and of course Joe can probably give you more details than I can, that now connects the sound of your name to the image of your face. Our brains are constantly being affected. They're being affected by facts that we hear. A lecture can change your attitude. A movie, a song can affect you. So, of course, our brains, or our minds, depending on how you see it, I think mind is just part of brain. It's a manifestation of brain, if you will. Can be affected by biochemical changes or disease processes. Sometimes things aren't going well. So, names, facts, observations, anything you experience affects how you are. So, of course, if it affects your brain, it can affect your mood. All this to say very simply that the brain is obviously a complex organ, and that's all I'm going to say about it. But, of course, for some of us, it ain't that complicated. I'm not sure which one is more representative of my brain, but anyway. Okay, so let's ask ourselves a question. When something is wrong with me, is it my brain that's going wrong, or is it my life? I'll take a few minutes to talk about mental illness as a category. Mental illness obviously involves, or invariably involves, an interaction between what we're born with, what we call our nature, and what we experience and what we learn, or what we live, our nurture, our upbringing. This nature-nurture debate, of course, affects everything and every mental illness. Sometimes an illness is more purely biological. If you develop schizophrenia, for example, most people consider it a disease, just like Parkinson's or something else. But even that disease is affected by things around you, by your upbringing, by your surroundings, by what you've learned, and so on. So you can't separate those two things. Biology and experience always go together. When we talk about what is a mental illness, for the most part, we're talking about extreme cases of something we all experience. Occasionally we have pure diseases, but more often than not, if a person is anxious, if a person is depressed, well, we all get depressed. We all get anxious. The question is how anxious or how depressed. So we tend to say when it's at this extreme, we'll call it something. But we're really not talking about categories. We're talking about extreme examples of normal life experience. Okay? So that's why the manual of diagnosis is called a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That's what DSM stands for. When you think about statistical, what we really mean is we're going to look at average people and say when someone is at one end of a statistical curve, we're going to call them something, just for sake of being able to talk about some dysfunction that we can then learn to treat and so on. So a diagnosis helps us communicate. When you say someone is depressed, or if I'm agoraphobic, or if I have a panic disorder, most of the professionals know what you're referring to. So it helps in that way. If you say you're diabetic, another doctor will know what that means. So we use diagnoses because it helps us communicate information, and more importantly, it allows us to conduct research to kind of figure out, okay, what can we do for people that we call this, whatever the diagnosis is, okay? That's the purpose of it, but none of you really care. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you are diagnosable or not. They're descriptive They're descriptive clinical terms. It's a judgment. Okay, this person is so depressed that they're not functioning well. We're going to help them. We're going to treat them. I think what really matters to the individual is how they're feeling and how they're functioning. Whether or not you reach a statistical cutoff is almost irrelevant. So, before we continue to talk about stats, I just want to deviate a little bit and talk about, is mental illness a disease? I don't know if you talked about that last week, but anyway, it's an important question that people constantly ask, so here it is. Let's suppose that Joe eats well, but has bad arteries, has coronary artery disease. You would say, well, he has a disease. What about Bob? He eats lousy. He eats hot dogs all the time and eats hamburgers and French fries, and somehow, magically, he has great arteries. So he has no disease. Then there's Bill. Bill eats badly and as a result has bad arteries. So what you see in these three examples, you can have an outcome that is negative based on either some sort of genetic vulnerability or some experiential factor, and sometimes you don't have either. Sometimes you are protected from it. So we call it diathesis. So where is the problem? Is it in the genetic predisposition? Is it in the environment in which we live and learn? Is it in the nature of the interaction between the two? Obviously, it's most likely the interaction. Sometimes it's more biologically based, sometimes it's more environmentally based, but often it's a bit of a combination of both. Now, ask yourself, if your wife, your husband, your lover decided they no longer loved you and left you, and you got depressed, well, ask yourself, what would your mood be? How would you be affected? How would you feel? If you couldn't function, you couldn't go to work, or if you were constantly crying and weren't able to concentrate, or maybe thought about killing yourself, had those kinds of thoughts. And then, if those thoughts lasted, or that mood lasted for more than 2 weeks, you would qualify for a diagnosis of major depression. Are you diseased? Are you mentally ill? I don't think it really matters, as I said. What matters is that you're having a hard time, and if there's something that someone can do to help you, then so be it. Okay? So, as I said, does it really matter? If we go back to the question of whether we're suffering from a diagnosable condition or not, the two key factors in a psychiatric diagnosis is some sort of personal experience, some sort of personal suffering. If I have an anxiety disorder that makes me constantly preoccupied with the thought of having to go to the dentist, and I don't sleep for 3 days because I have to go to a dentist, and I have a phobia, even if I can go and I can get my teeth fixed and I can function, I'm still suffering. So I would say I have a phobia. If, on the other hand, I don't suffer because I just don't make a dental appointment, then I also have a phobia. So most of the psychiatric diagnoses use those criteria. Is there some sort of personal effect on us? Are we suffering? Are we having a hard time with whatever the condition is? And is it affecting or is it affecting our ability to function normally, either at work, at school, interpersonally, or in some other area? You can obviously have both. The point is that if a problem exists, whether or not you reach the statistical extreme, you can, sometimes you should, consider treatment. So, where do you draw the line with respect to depression? If we look at this curve, this is a normal curve. Go back to the issue of statistics. And if any of you have studied stats, this is your basic element in statistics, a normal curve. And if you were to look at this, and let's say you plotted this is how high the curve is the number of people. And let's suppose that this was height. Okay? So you have a few people that are really, really tall. You have a few people who are not very tall. And most of us are somewhere in the middle. Yeah, I'd find myself probably around here. I could use being a bit taller. I'm a little less than average. And of course, if we were to plot weight, maybe I'd find myself a little bit over here. Okay? So, if you were to take this plot with any condition, we're talking about depression tonight, so we'll talk about that, you would see that there are a number of people who are really, really happy. And there's a few of you here. Then, of course, there's, a larger number, not a huge number, of people who are always happy. Then there's most of us. Well, most of us are kind of okay. Our moods are okay. We're pretty positive for the most part. Some of us, some people are generally unhappy. And then, of course, there's a small number of people who are really, really unhappy or sad. And the point is that you can talk about almost any condition in the same way. So where do you say a person needs help? Where do you say you need help? Whether there is help available or not. Sometimes the question is, what is normal? Okay? So the truth is that kind of everything is normal. But some things are more normal than others. Okay? So, technically, here's the only technical slide I have for you. What is depression as a diagnosis? Depression involves either a depressed mood, pretty obvious, or a loss of pleasure. And what that means, depressed mood means you're sad, you're crying, you really, really, really see things in a dark way. Or you don't feel particularly sad. You can feel very flat. You can almost feel nothing. And a lot of people who feel depressed have this flattening. It's called anhedonia. It's a loss of pleasure in things that normally give you pleasure. So you can either have one or the other or both. And you have to have that. If you have that, it's considered depressive symptoms. Now, usually when we talk about depression, we also use indicators. But these are indicators of the depressed mood or the loss of pleasure. And that includes sleep problems. A depressed person may have trouble falling asleep, may not sleep well, usually wakes up early and has trouble falling asleep again. And in those cases, oftentimes their mood is worse in the morning. They have trouble concentrating. Now obviously if you don't sleep, you're going to have trouble concentrating. But people have trouble concentrating even if they're sleeping because they're preoccupied, they can't really focus. They could be agitated, fatigued. Again, fatigue, part of the sleep problem or independent of it. Often they have recurrent thoughts of suicide or death. Doesn't mean that a person necessarily thinks about committing suicide. They might think, I wish I wasn't here, or I wish I was hit by a truck. Or we might be preoccupied with existential questions about the meaning of life and so on. So there's this preoccupation that people have. There are changes in appetite. Usually this means a loss of weight, loss of appetite. People always say, well, when I'm depressed, I eat. The truth is that when people are depressed, they usually don't eat very much. Okay. Obviously, I'm not very depressed very often. And they have feelings of worthlessness. So those are the symptoms, those are the indicators. What's important is that they have to last in order for you to qualify for a diagnosis, if you really need to know, is that generally if it lasts for 2 weeks, it has to last for at least 2 weeks. And the reason for that is because you probably recognize yourselves in this list. From time to time we all go through that. We all feel sad and so on. At what point is it unusual? Well, it's unusual if it lasts for a couple of weeks at least. And also it has to have a significant impact. It has to affect you either personally through what I mentioned before, the personal suffering, or some sort of loss of function. Okay? Now, the talk was depression and burnout. So what the hell is burnout then? If we're talking about depression here. Well, burnout is not really a psychiatric diagnosis, even though a lot of times people are off on leaves because of burnout and so on, and we talk about it. Many people use the term burnout to refer to a variety of conditions. Often they are referring to depression. Here's how I see it, if you will, and it's almost an arbitrary definition because there isn't any agreed upon definition of burnout, we can, hi Sue, by the way, I still remember. Burnout usually refers to, the most common definition of it, refers to some sort of loss of function at work. It could be in other areas. You don't have to be working. You might be at school, and if you can't function, you need to drop out. Usually people refer to that as some sort of burnout. Involves anxiety, frustration, a sense of futility, what's the point, agitation, fatigue, frustration, impatience, pessimism, all of the things that you see a depressed person experiences as well. A little more stress-related, if you will, but for the most part it refers to I can't function at work. It's a term that was originally applied to workers in the helping profession like doctors and nurses. So it was a term that was coined by researchers to look at people who are in the helping professions, what happens to them when they need help? They get burnt out. But the term obviously has become popular and we all use it and so on, so now we apply it to everyone. And of course, popular culture has adopted the term to refer to anything from a severe depression or worse to I need a change in my life, I'm getting burnt out. Okay? So it's not very precise. As I said, it doesn't have a standard diagnosis. So what's the difference between depression and burnout? As I said, burnout is more of a circumstance. It can happen when we are depressed. If you think about it, if you're depressed, one of the definitions is you can't function normally. So of course you're going to be burnt out, or you're more likely to be on a burnout leave. It can happen because you're having trouble at work and your mood and your stress is affected by work, but if you were to magically change jobs, it would disappear. It's influenced by many of the personality factors that cause depression. Now we're going to explore that in a little bit. If you think about that, two people can have the same tasks to do, same working conditions. One person could be depressed and another one might not be depressed. Obviously the difference is who they are and their personality. And our personality interacts with our circumstances to create our mood or to affect our mood. And so anything that affects mood also can affect our functioning at work. Whereas depression is a bit of a broader term. I call it refers more to a mood state rather than a specific area of functioning. So of course it can cause a burnout. And it can be caused by burnout. Let's suppose that I'm having trouble at work, and because of that, it's going to cause trouble for me to function. And if I can't function at work, and if I define myself as a person who is valuable and important, and if I can't function, wouldn't that affect my mood? And wouldn't I be depressed simply because I can't function at work? And of course, it could be influenced by the same personality factors that cause depression. So we're really going to talk more about personality and mood today and what affects us. Whether or not it's a burnout or depression is almost irrelevant. As I said, what's important is its impact on us and how we feel. So of course, because depression is a broader term, it obviously doesn't always have anything to do with our work circumstances. So what are some of the causes of depression and burnout? Well, they can be biological, situational, or psychological. Biological. Well, some people do have a genetic predisposition. Sometimes it is just the way we are made up. Some people are more prone to depression. I think what you see, however, you'll see different innate temperaments. If you have more than one child, if you have siblings, if you have two kittens from the same litter, you will see that their characters are very different. You see one person who's sort of, laissez-faire, another one very hard-headed. some people who seem to be always happy-go-lucky, and others who are always serious. So we can have moods that run in families, but even within the same genetic makeup, we all are born with slightly different variations of temperament. And so that makes who we are. We also have situations: a loss of job, debt, bankruptcy, separations. And of course, in the end, we have our psychological traits. A trait can be a strength or a weakness. If I'm the kind of person who is a very determined perfectionist, and I have to get it right, and I'm an engineer, and I get it right, I feel really good about myself. What happens when I have some symptom of a physical ailment and the doctors can't give me an answer? Now I have to deal with the fact that I don't know for sure. And if I'm the kind of person who likes to know for sure, then I might have a much harder time in a situation that is unclear than another person who is more flexible and able to sort of ride the waves. So we have our learning and our environment that create who we are. There are biological processes, as I said. There are hormonal changes. We eat, it affects us. We age, there are constant changes. There are diurnal mood variations sometimes because we also have changing hormones during the day and so on. So there's a number of biological, biochemical processes, plus our genetic makeup, our learning. All this creates how we see the world. How we see the world is going to be attached to our mood. So I put those two together. Those moods could be positive or negative. And when they're negative, they create depression. Notice I said depression or depressive symptoms because depression or mood, negative mood is a symptom. It's a reaction. It can be a reaction to something, or it can also be an illness by itself. You can have a depression caused by a bipolar condition, for example, that has very little to do with your circumstances. But for the most part, we're dealing with symptoms. We see signs of depression. Now, what's interesting about a depressed mood is that it creates in us what we call a cognitive triad, or the result of depression, or the essence of depression, if you will, is this cognitive triad, which is a negative way of seeing yourself, of seeing the world around you, and of seeing the future. Now, think about what that means. When you get depressed, it's as if you put a filter over your eyes, and everything you see is dark. All the nice things around you are not very nice. You look at yourself, you look in the mirror, you see a loser, you see a bad person. And more importantly, when you look at the future, what do you see? Well, it's going to be even worse. Could you imagine being optimistic and depressed? Not going to happen. In other words, what comes with depression is pessimism. You cannot be optimistic and depressed. When you're depressed, you're going to be pessimistic. If you think about that, if a depressed person says, "How am I going to feel tomorrow? What's it going to be like tomorrow?" The person will only see that things will be worse. And that makes them feel worse. So the perceptual changes created by depression feed the depression. So it's very hard to think fairly when you're in a mood, because your mood affects how you see things. And if you see things negatively, and you keep thinking about things around you, you keep feeling worse and worse.